only more complex sector of society these days would be whatever it is that's happening at LaGuardia. But short of that, we're here to talk about the future of agriculture and the interconnectedness, the dependencies, the globalization, effects, the dependencies, the challenges, and so forth. We have nowhere near enough time, so please forgive me with abbreviated biographies of two extraordinary panelists, and it's such a pleasure to be sitting with them. Thank you to the Honorable Tom Vilsack, serving as President and CEO of the U.S. Dairy Export Council. He served as the United States Secretary of Agriculture from 2009 to 2017.
That's good enough.
One more thing, he is the former two-term governor of my home state of Iowa. That's good enough. Moderator privilege, I'm going to say we will have no Iowa jokes today. And let me move on to our second esteemed panelist, Ms. Sara Menker. A thought leader in ag tech, Sara is founder and CEO of Gro-Intelligence. However, she began her career on Wall Street, where she was an energy trader. She has a million accolades, as does Mr. Vilsack, but we don't have time for that. I will simply say, Gro-Intelligence is not an Uber for what? As you often hear people talk about tech innovations, but rather what she's doing is new and completely different. Big data, innovative modeling, and new efficiencies in agriculture. I'm in awe of the stewardship from the governor. I'm in awe of the innovation from Sara, and I welcome each of them to give several minutes of overview to give you a glimpse into their fascinating work, fascinating lives, and how they're looking at the future. Governor.
Well, thank you very much. It's great to be with all of you today. In thinking about the remarks that I wanted to make concerning agriculture generally, I would say if there was one word that I wanted to leave you with, it would be diversity. I think that this is the most exciting time in American agriculture in recent history. We're seeing a growth of diversity in operators. We're beginning to see more women, more people of color get into the farming business, and that is certainly a positive given the aging nature of the American farm population. We're seeing an expansion of where farming takes place, from urban rooftop gardens to community gardens in urban centers to vertical agriculture in warehouses that have been converted into massive green spaces to the traditional farming operations that you would normally associate with rural places. There are now opportunities with aeroponics and hydroponics, and we also have agriculture in a sense taking place in laboratories with synthetic food production. So an incredible diversity there. Diversity in commodities. Not only are we seeing continuation of the commodities that have traditionally defined agriculture, but we're beginning to see the birth of a new set of commodities tied to conservation practices. Ecosystem service markets developing, which will create new revenue streams for farmers and more job opportunities in rural places. And I suspect in the discussion that we'll have about climate that we may get into more detail about that. We're seeing diversity in economic opportunity in terms of where our products go. Not only do we sell, obviously, here in the United States, but about 30% of all the agricultural production that takes place in the country is now exported. And as we see a growing world population, the importance of exports, the importance of American agriculture, leading an effort to become more productive. It has been estimated by the United Nations that we need a 50 to 70% increase in food production to be able to meet the population growth that will take place the next 10, 20, 30 years. In addition, we're seeing diversity in consumers. We're seeing individual consumers demanding not only more information about where their food is being produced and how it's being produced, but having it tailored to meet their specific needs. As we gain more information about our own DNA, our own propensity, or the aspect of our own health, there are now a growing movement of arranging foods for particular health conditions. We're going to see significant growth in that opportunity in the very near future. Will it be a challenging time for agriculture? Absolutely. Climate change obviously is going to impact and affect where food is grown, how it's grown. what kind of risk and dangers it faces with reference not only to weather, but also pests and diseases. But I am optimistic about the future of American agriculture, and I look forward to the conversation. Certainly data is going to, I'll finish with this, certainly data is going to play an incredibly important role as American production agriculture becomes more precise, relies more on data, the use of drones and sensors, to be more efficient with the use of everything from fertilizers to water, so that we will be able to continue to grow more while actually using less. And I think that's the major challenge that American agriculture faces.
Thank you. With that, Sara, we'd love to hear more.
All right. One thing Tracy did not mention is that I went to Columbia, so I will acknowledge that. I went here for grad school. So I think, I was taking notes in terms of all the different layers of diversity as we think about agriculture, and the end point around data was a perfect segue into potentially a discussion around some of the things I wanted to highlight, which is I think there's a very big discussion around the use of data to make farmers better. But we, as a company, are actually much more focused on using data to drive the decisions of organizations that interact with farmers better as well. And so I think that's one of the big kind of layers of information and the information revolution that we believe we need to make, essentially the supply chain a lot more efficient. Because if we got farmers very efficient, but the system around the farmer hasn't learned to kind of drive those efficiencies as well, you start to end up with massive dislocations in markets. We talked about the context of the US, and so maybe we can take a step back and say, what's the state of global agriculture today in kind of from a more global perspective? It's a world of a few countries that are net exporters of ag, and most of the fastest growing parts of the world net importers of agriculture and agricultural products. So, the United States, increasing Brazil, Argentina, but now increasingly the Black Sea region in the form of Russia and Ukraine are the big net exporters. And then you have regions such as China and Sub-Saharan Africa as massive net importers of global ag products. And India is in a very unique position in that it's basically net neutral. And that's also potentially going to change, largely actually due to climate change. But you have a world that really, really relies on the world economic order to function properly for most of us to eat the way that we're eating today. The system is designed around governments that can communicate and negotiate in effective ways to enable that to happen. And I think where we're headed now as a world is one where regions such as Sub-Saharan Africa and China are going to have much greater import demand needs in a world that's increasingly fragmented. And so one of the big, we've spent a lot of time looking at, where's the calorie demand going to come from? And then who's going to fill that demand? And there could be some real fundamental shifts to how agricultural trading as a whole works if we don't fix what we have in place, right? And so that could be through enhanced production and productivity in these regions. Because if you look at regions like Sub-Saharan Africa, the potential for farmers to increase their yields is, in some key crops, you're looking at 3, 4, 5x potential in terms of increase in yield. And does that actually solve the problem? Yes, we don't have to actually, use more land and keep expanding acreage. It is about, I think, grow more with less. And that means fixing the capital markets around agriculture. That means figuring out how to hedge risk in more products than the 4 or 5 traded agricultural products that we have today. Agriculture is very diverse. One of the things I always say is, I was an energy trader before I started Gro-Intelligence, and I'm so happy I was very naive at how complicated what we were setting out to do was going to be, which was to build an AI that was going to understand global agriculture as an entire system, irrespective of region or crop. That means that you end up looking at tens of thousands of different products, not, oil is oil, gas is gas, and that's the big thing I forgot to clarify in my mind, which was oil's produced around the world, but the way you produce it is fundamentally the same. There's different grades, but production is highly concentrated because it costs so much to produce. It's highly regulated, so information about it is standardized. Whereas agriculture is highly local, and the best data from each country comes in its local language, not in English. The best data about a particular crop tends to come from that crop's association. And so when you multiply that by the number of countries we have and the number of products that agriculture represents, you end up in this very complex real world system that we're only now beginning to understand. But I think if we enhance that understanding, we can actually transform the system to be the system we want it to be. But information will be the driving force behind that.
So, not at all small issues here, but there are three broad topics I'd like to cover before we then open to questions, because I think you'll agree that these are highly provocative topics. I want to start with, as Sara said, the world economic order, and specifically as it relates to the future of agriculture. We have recent trade deals in the news. In fact, today I think there was first mention of a potential trade talks, at least, with Kenya, something that the U.S. has never done. But in particular, we have the USMCA, or NAFTA 2.0, a bipartisan trade bill, and the so-called phase one of the China deal. Third, we've got Brexit and what that means for the US-UK trade relations. All of these seem critical to the future of agriculture in the most global sense, with all of the complexities that we understand. I would be grateful to hear from Governor Vilsack about these trade deals sort of writ large, and also what's essential to these agreements as it relates to the future of agriculture.
Well, as I mentioned, 30% of what we grow is exported. 20% of every farm dollar that's income it comes from trade. So it's obviously incredibly important for U.S. agriculture. Let me take these trade agreements in order and include an additional one, which I think actually for American agriculture may be the most significant one, at least initially. The USMCA agreement basically maintains status quo for most commodities in the U.S. It provides an open market to Mexico, which is for many of the commodities a number one or number two market. It does provide a bit of protection in the dairy industry for and against the EU's efforts to try to monopolize certain cheese names in an effort to get a market advantage. But for the most part, the Mexican side of this trade agreement from an agricultural perspective is status quo, just simply ratifying the status quo. With reference to Canada, probably the two commodities that benefited from this agreement are wheat, with a slightly easier access into the Canadian market, and U.S. dairy in two ways. One, additional market opportunities, but very small, roughly equivalent to what we would have received under the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the difference being that we don't have to divide this particular set of quotas, tariff quotas, with any other nation. So it does provide a bit of additional access. It also eliminates a pricing system that the Canadians used to try to deal with their surplus of powder. All of us have discovered or rediscovered butter. When we've rediscovered butter, it essentially creates a byproduct of powder. The Canadians have a supply management system. They didn't really have any place to put the powder that they were now getting because they were producing a lot of butter. So they decided to create a pricing system that allowed them to export that powder at below world prices, which caused a great disruption in the powder market. They have agreed to scrap that system, to limit the amount of exports, so that they would essentially deal with whatever challenges their system creates within Canada, which is consistent with supply management principles. So that's a benefit to the U.S. dairy industry. The one thing about the USMCA I think that is beneficial for agriculture is the opportunity to raise questions if agreements are not being enforced. The Canadians from time to time have a tendency to sort of redefine and reinterpret trade agreements to benefit their dairy industry, which is politically very strong. So this process allows us to raise questions, which we weren't able to do under NAFTA. So significant, maybe $300 million, $400 million increase in trade opportunities for American agriculture, but primarily maintaining status quo. The China Phase 1 agreement, you know, there is a giant loophole in that agreement with the Chinese basically saying, look, we will buy $40 billion of agricultural products based on market conditions. Based on market conditions. They get to define market conditions. They're already suggesting, perhaps, with the virus, that is obviously a very challenging situation for the Chinese government, and unfortunately deadly. They are now basically beginning to raise some concerns about whether or not they'll be able to purchase all of those goods. If they do purchase those goods, essentially what it has done is it essentially puts us back to where we were. It's not really an increase. It sounds like an increase in agricultural sales, but in essence, it makes up for the losses that occurred for the first 2 years during the trade dispute with China, with no guarantee that we will ever get to Phase 2. It's a long conversation, which I'm not going to get into, but we are essentially asking the Chinese government in these trade discussions to fundamentally change the way in which they do business in China with state-owned enterprises. And I don't think, given the importance of state-owned enterprises to maintaining party discipline and control of that large country, that President Xi is liable to give that away. So I think the Phase 2 of this is going to be, we will be waiting a long time for Phase 2. The agreement that did make a difference and does make a difference for America, I think, is the Japanese agreement. There was, in fact, commitments made by the Japanese government to essentially put us back in the same position we would have been if we'd continued with TPP. We were at a competitive disadvantage in beef, pork, dairy. In Japan, that competitive disadvantage has now been eliminated, so we should see a pickup of trade opportunities in that very significant market for us. With Brexit, the reality is no one can tell you precisely how the UK-US trade discussions will take place or how the US-EU trade discussions will take place until the UK and the EU have finished their transition negotiations. Because we don't know whether or not the UK will be under any, excuse me, any kind of restrictions based on the customs union that they have been part of. Will they still make it more difficult for biotech products to enter the UK market? Will they still require a ban on chlorinated chicken? Will they still have concerns about hormones in beef? Some of the practices that are commonplace here where there have been serious objections in the European market. Until those matters get resolved, I don't know how we really know whether or not there's an opportunity for the U.S. The Trump administration values bilateral negotiations, but the reality is that these negotiations take a very, very long time. And I think it is a welcome thing that there are conversations with Kenya. There may very well be a quick deal there, and it's important for us to get an inroad into that important and growing continent. But I think for the next 10 to 15 to 20 years, the major opportunity for us, U.S. agriculture, is likely to be in Asia.
Thank you. And as we think about the reality of the countries with whom we're enacting or attempting to enact trade deals, there's a presumption of stability in those countries. And that's a really big presumption. And as it relates to our topic here on the future of agriculture, I think it is incumbent upon us to speak about food security. How is food security related to the political stability of a particular country? I also am very curious to hear from both of our panelists about food security as it relates to climate change, but I think we'll circle back to that. But when we think about the uncertainties as it relates to food security, I'm quite sure that Sara has thoughts to share.
Yeah, food security is it's a loaded term. And it is because it means very different things to different countries depending on where you are. And the way that I describe it often, even when we have team discussions, is in a lot of parts of the world, food security is national security. It's not, food security is not discussed as national security as much in the United States, but places like China, food security is absolutely national security. And in fact, if you look at the last 5-year plan from China, their goals around food security are very nuanced in their definition, which is achieve self-sufficiency in essential grains, essentially, and also achieve absolute food security. They don't even refer to it as food security. So a lot of us have always defined food security as self-sufficiency. The Chinese actually don't define that because they say, we recognize that we're not going to be self-sufficient in everything. There is a minimum condition of things that we need to be self-sufficient in, which is in cereal grains. So it's basically the things to avoid a revolution. And then there's this concept of absolute food security, which is defined as a way to secure what we need in a very diversified way. And so, and I think this ties a lot to trade discussions, because if you look at China's current import infrastructure and trading relationships, it's heavily dependent on 2 countries, the United States and Brazil. And Brazil, has only been in the last 5 to 10 years that it's really ramped up in terms of that relationship building. So there's this very kind of intentional decision around diversifying that. Because if you diversify it, then at least you have this concept of absolute food security defined in a different way. And that's actually quite unique to the Chinese, because I was born and raised in Ethiopia. When a lot of African governments speak about food security, they're talking about self-sufficiency. And there's this very big nuanced difference. But food security is also in so many ways tied not just to, am I producing enough? It's, am I producing enough in a safe enough way? Food safety is a big part of food security. And this could be a good segue into the discussion on climate, but food safety is at risk with climate change because plant disease, animal disease, human disease is actually very closely linked with climate. And so if you look at what's happening both on the crop side as well as on the livestock side, there's huge correlations there. And so it's no longer about even producing enough, is what I'm producing safe enough for my people to eat. And so there's kind of multiple layers of food security and how it's defined, but I think it's at its core, people will start to redefine what that means, and that also means better understanding dependencies and diversifying those dependencies so that you don't end up in a situation where you're literally just left with a one-on-one bilateral conversation between 2 countries. And so I think that you'll see a lot more of diversification.
Okay. Can I pick up on the comment about food security and different definitions? I think Americans ought to recognize and ought to appreciate that they are far more secure because of American agriculture. We're one of the few countries in the world that actually can produce enough for us to essentially feed ourselves. We don't really have to import food in this country from any source. We import so we have avocados 12 months a year instead of 2 or 3 months a year. It is about choice. It's about diversity and a wide array of foods available at all times. And I believe very, very, very deeply that the security that we take for granted in this country isn't a result of the words of the Declaration of Independence or our great Constitution, but is in large part because we have mostly fed people and employed people. And we have fed people in part because of American agriculture and in part because of nutrition programs that provide some kind of assistance and help to people that are struggling financially. These are very important to the security of this country and oftentimes not seen in that way. And I think we should reflect on that. The other thing I would say is part of the challenge with reference to food security is also not just in this country but in other countries, primarily developing countries, to avoid food waste. You mentioned supply chain. The reality is, and the safety of food, the reality is if you can't refrigerate it, can't store it, can't transport it properly, then it not only is it not safe to consume, but it's wasted. And estimates are 30% of the food that's produced in the world is wasted. So as we deal with this issue of climate change and having to produce more with less, one way we can begin to fill the gap that will essentially exist, or does exist, is by eliminating food waste. And if we did that, the 850 million or so people that are food insecure, however you define that, would probably have sufficient food to be able to feel more secure.
The uncertainties play into all of these dependencies in so many obvious and perhaps less obvious ways. I think perhaps food waste is an example of that. As we're looking at climate change across the globe, I can't help but zoom back into the Midwest of this country, where flooding has been an incredible problem over the past year plus, and the impact of what that means, not just for farmers, but then the subsequent supply chain. That's but one example of myriad. I would like to talk about climate change as it relates to things like water and drought and flooding, and also climate change as it relates to attempting to model the efficiencies across that supply chain. This is something we'll attempt to do in a period of minutes, as opposed to, I don't know, 4 semesters or something like that. But we have 2 esteemed experts here, and I believe climate change is worthy of a discussion, whether it's specific to these subtopics or others that they would like to address. But let's please turn to climate change.
Well, let me begin. When I was secretary, we established a series of climate hubs. They were essentially 7 hubs and 3 sub-hubs, and they were charged with a coordinated effort between land-grant universities, our Forest Service, and our own research services at USDA to begin to analyze the vulnerabilities of every part of the U.S. in terms of agriculture and forestry, and to begin the process of educating producers about steps they could take to mitigate and to adapt to a changing climate. That led to a commitment at USDA to climate-smart agriculture practices that we believe will allow us to begin the process of adaptation and mitigation. The current administration has continued those climate hubs, but they don't call them climate hubs. I can't remember what euphemism they use, but because they're having a hard time acknowledging that the climate's changing. That's my view of that anyway. But nevertheless, that good work is still continuing. There is a serious problem that this country is going to face in the western U.S. With lack of water. It is very likely in the state of Colorado, for example, the one that I'm most familiar with, that in the next 10 to 15 years, if they don't identify 1 million acre-foot of water that they currently don't have, that they will need, then they may have to actually choose between growing and expanding cities for a growing population in Colorado, or stopping agriculture as they have known it for years as part of their tradition and culture. Literally, it's that kind of choice that they will face simply because they will lack the water resources to do both. So it is incumbent upon us to really begin to focus on strategies for reclaiming water, reusing water, conserving water, ways in which we can use gene editing, et cetera, to figure out crops that will be able to be more productive, understand photosynthesis, and make sure that we can grow more with less over time, or we will face a pretty serious problem in the western U.S. because of climate. The last thing I would say is to look at this on the opportunity side. I think we have a tendency in this country to constantly talk about climate change and all of the risks and challenges and hazards that are associated with it, and that's certainly understandable. But it does create a whole new opportunity and set of opportunities for American agriculture. As I like to say, you can sequester a whole lot more carbon in Brooklyn, Iowa than you can Brooklyn, New York. And the reality is we need to use our land resources more efficiently to gain control of greenhouse gas emissions. The U.S. agriculture industry is beginning to take this thing very seriously, and I think you will see over the course of the next 12 months commitments from major U.S. agriculture to get to a zero-emission future. I think the dairy industry is well on its way to getting there now, and that involves capturing methane and converting it into fuel and energy, It's using feed additives to reduce the amount of methane in livestock. It's taking the manure from livestock and converting it into a multitude of new products where essentially you replicate nature with little or no waste associated with agriculture and livestock production. It is a brand new way to think about agriculture, a more profitable way, in my view, to think about agriculture, and certainly a more sustainable way, as questions are being raised today about the sustainability of livestock industry, for example. So I think there is some exciting new opportunities while we're also faced with some serious challenges because of climate change.
Whenever I talk about climate change, I always think of the headlines that I read on any kind of article around climate change, which every headline is all about certainty. And if you actually read any of the scientific papers, it's all about uncertainty and modeling uncertainty, which is what makes climate change so complex. And we talk about the IPCC as if it's a single model, and it actually is looking at 21 different models of climate change and coming up with some pretty sophisticated kind of probability distributions around it. So one of the things that I think of very often about climate change is how do we better communicate the reality of what it actually means? Because I think you get more buy-in and you drive more behavioral change if society begins to understand and appreciate it in much more tangible ways versus in the abstract. And if we also are very clear about what the uncertainties are, because we need to manage for those uncertainties. And so that's just kind of like my opening all the time, because there's a lot that we know and there's a lot we don't know. And so being prepared for what we don't know is also as important. When thinking about issues such as water, I think of a conversation that I had with a farmer, one of the largest vegetable producers in California, who told me about the Groundwater Management Act and encouraged me to go read about it, and said, listen, once this is fully in play, we could lose 25 to 30% of our total production in California. California is the breadbasket of green leafy vegetables for the United States. And these are not inconsequential numbers in terms of what it actually means for the economy. But what it's also led farmers to do is to start to diversify where they're growing and where they're buying land. So farmers like that no longer concentrate their holdings in a single state, but they now own land across 12 states. And their big challenge now becomes, how do I make the supply chain as efficient as I figured out how to do it in one single location? And how do I not drive the cost of product up to the consumer in that process, right? Because there's also inefficiencies that you get from that. And so there's going to be some real challenges around what that means for pricing of food and how that will impact us. And just if you think about it just in the local and domestic context in the US. Now when you think about this in the global context, one of the things that's very hard around managing for climate change, if you think of take any food and beverage company in the world, the number of products that they're procuring and where they're procuring from is insanely large. So they have these massively complex portfolios of dependencies at a global scale. When what we're doing today, when we're defining things like drought, is defining it on a national scale. So in the US, there's the US Drought Monitor, but that doesn't scale to the rest of the world. And so figuring out how we build and design products for organizations to better manage for climate risk will become a critical part of it, because we need to build markets around climate. This is not going to be, this transition is not going to be an easy one. And the role that private industry and financial markets will have to play is unlike any other time. And so figuring out the right mechanisms whereby we're developing and building products and standardizing how we define things across borders is going to be absolutely critical.
There's a very good point about the supply chain. Not only do we have to make it more efficient, but the reality is our consumers here in the US and in other developed countries are demanding to know more about where their food comes from, how it's produced. So in addition to being able to get it to the market more efficiently, we have to get it to the market with information that will allow the seller of that product to be more transparent. And so you get into blockchain and you get into all of the data-driven decision-making that you talked about is going to be incredibly important. That then raises the question about price and whether or not, again, Americans don't realize this, and don't appreciate it. They think they pay a lot for their food. The reality is you pay very little for your food as a percentage of your income, probably one of the lowest, if not the lowest, in the developed world. We spend 6 to 7% of your take-home pay for food. You go to any other developing country or developed country, and it's 20, 25, 30, 40, 50%. So as you go into the grocery store next time, just ask yourself, what are you doing with that extra 10 to 15% that the efficiency of the current system within the U.S. is providing you? And when was the last time you thanked a farmer for that? But I think there is a challenge on the price side, and that then creates issues relative to our nutrition programs, and it ripples through this national security and security issue. So it is very complicated.
Okay. One thing that we are certain about is our limited time. And I imagine there's several questions percolating among the audience. I think we maybe have time for 2. So, sir.
It's a well-known fact that we're increasing a lot natural gas supply production as well as oil, and one of the ways it's through the promotion of fracking. Fracking is in direct competition with farming for the water commodity. Frackers are typically paying a lot more than farmers can afford to pay for irrigation of their farms. What can we do, other than the obvious for 2020, to balance that so that you're getting the whammy from the climate change problem because of fracking and methane emissions, but even worse, you're getting the price competition problem on the water commodity, especially in areas that are hit by droughts, whether it's California, wildfires, and other locations where you need farmers to have access to water.
I don't know if folks heard that question. I'm going to try to paraphrase it, sir, and if I get it wrong. I think it had to do with the fact that farmers and the land that they have or the land that they need for farming is in competition with those who are in the fracking industry who want to use that same land to be able to extract natural gas. And well, I'm getting there. And in doing so are essentially utilizing the water that farmers would otherwise be using for irrigation or other purposes. And how do you deal with this? Because the natural gas folks are in a position to pay more than farmers can afford. I don't know that I have a very good answer to your question, but I'll give it a shot. First of all, I don't know that it's necessarily akin to a federal response. My guess is that individual states are going to have to deal with this issue, in large part because the political pressure to deal with it is likely to be more local than federal, and the chances of actually having some kind of system at the state level that creates equity between farm interests and energy interests, I think there's a greater chance that that balance might be struck at the state level. Once states begin to do this, there may very well then be a demand on the part of both industries for some kind of standardization of the response. I would also say that I think it puts a premium on us utilizing better technology and better data to utilize the water that we do have and that is available to farmers. I think there is tremendous research being done now on crops that are drought resistant and ways in which we can use gene editing and so forth to create more productivity using less water. I can tell you in the dairy industry that they have created significant efficiencies in terms of dairy production where they are essentially producing a lot more milk with a lot less water, a lot less greenhouse gas emissions, and a lot less land. And I think we need to replicate that in other parts of agriculture. But it's a very difficult question. And then you get into the circumstance where, because of the aging nature of farmers, nature of farmers themselves, their family members may not necessarily want to continue the farm. So they may be living in the city and they may be interested in selling the farm. And the farm neighbor may want to buy the land, but the developing rights, the energy rights, may drive the cost to the point where farmers don't have access to that land, and that's going to cause some challenges.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I data analytics really are being used, some examples of how they're being used to address the challenges we're facing in the industry today?
So, I mean, I just think of how we do it and what we're doing as a company. And we always say, you know, people have always asked us, you know, are you building this for a crop? Or are you building this for a country? And we say, no, it's a very complex real world system that's global, and it's a platform. And we don't know the range of problems that come at us, but we recognized relatively early, because it gave us time to build up the technology and the infrastructure required to do what I'm talking about now. But to say, we don't know what problems come at us, but when they do, we can respond significantly faster than we ever did before. And so, to give you some examples of things that we've done and that have been public, it's everything from when the government shutdown occurred last year, stepping in and actually generating the equivalent of what the WASDE forecast would have been, and just at least offering it for free and opening up the platform so that people could track that and have some semblance of what supply and demand balances were doing globally, because that report was missed 2 months in a row as a result of the government shutdown. Flooding. As soon as basically flooding conversations, and we started to see the right warning signals that these floods and the flooding in the Midwest was going to be very detrimental, we built models that did acreage loss risk models and started estimating the amount of acreage that was at risk of being essentially abandoned due to floods as early as late April, right? And so being able to track in near real time some of these occurrences versus having to wait for official statistics, which can take a while to come out, is one example. Another example is something like disease, animal disease, African swine fever. The complexities of something such as African swine fever to the entire global supply chain is very complicated. So as soon as you have something like that come out, we're talking about building these models in a matter of days and weeks as opposed to months and years. And so at this point, we're being thrown, problems day in and day out. And it can be related to climate, it can be related to markets. It almost doesn't matter if you have that kind of technical infrastructure to be able to react to that.
Can I know time's short, but let me add a couple of things on the ground, because that's incredibly important in terms of being able to stabilize markets and so forth. But on the ground, I think what we're getting to is a farmer will now not look at 80 acres, 160 acres, or 360 acres as a farm. They will look at each individual acre as a separate farm, so that they will provide greater precision with what they do on that particular acre, which will save inputs and increase productivity. And then secondly, to the extent that we can use data to speed the process up, one of the big challenges I think we face in this country is our democratic processes are slow. Our regulatory system is antiquated, and it cannot keep and is not keeping pace with change. It shouldn't take, frankly, shouldn't take weeks and months to put out reports, but it does. It shouldn't take literally years for regulatory action to be completed on evaluating a particular product or a particular trade or whatever. We need to figure out how to speed this process up without sacrificing the important work of quality and safety if we are going to keep pace with change. And the reason, and I'll finish with this, the reason we have to do this is because we are in a competition with our friends in China for trying to explain to the world who has a better system for making decisions and getting action and getting things done. Is it an autocratic system where you make decisions pretty quickly but you sacrifice certain freedoms and liberties? Or is it a system that gives you freedom and liberty but takes a little bit longer? We need to speed the process up so we don't lose that competition.
The harmoniousness of both perspectives here today is very striking, and I think we're all very privileged to be able to hear this conversation. And I thank you both. I certainly find it provocative. I certainly have even more questions now, and I look to your leadership and to your innovation, and now save us all. Thank you so much.